But thank you for doing so, and congratulations.
Thank you.
And you're plugged in, Amelia, so don't get up too far. Don't do anything like that. Don't say anything on the microphone. And we're running very well to time, because I'm sure you're all very busy people, and delighted to welcome Peter Hitchens up to the panel. Hello, Peter. Hello, I'm Paddy O'Connell. We'll plug you in, and there is no barman. He never came back. If anyone does have a direct line to him downstairs, please ask him to, because we are allowed to drink, aren't we? Oh, no, we don't go down to the club, don't. Because Peter's on the stage now.
But that's no reason not to go.
Well, congratulations on your nomination.
How kind.
If I was going to go in a different order, just so people don't get quite so bored with me, we know a lot about you. What does it mean to you to be nominated for the Orwell Prize?
Well, Orwell is the thing, and people here might find this surprising. But when, at the age of 15, somebody placed into my hands a copy of a book of essays published by Penguin called Inside the Whale, it altered my life. I'd read 1984, An Animal Farm, and I thought that was it. Just as people might have thought that the Lays of Ancient Rome and how Horatius held the bridge in the brave days of old was all of Macaulay, I didn't know. And then suddenly there was this huge ocean of undiscovered stuff before me, which has had ever afterwards a completely unalterable influence on everything I do. Think, say, write. And if ever I stray now from particularly the rules set out in politics and the English language, then I know that I've done it pretty quickly. And I feel ashamed of myself. And I think there are many, many other things. I have somewhere scattered around my house the original 4 volumes of the essays, Letters and Journalism, so thumbed and they're soft, like Romanian banknotes under Ceausescu. So therefore anything that might even begin to recognize that somebody as evil and wicked as me was influenced by the great George Orwell would be kind of satisfying.
Well, let me say something independently to you, which proves that you are ploughing a very unique furrow. I read the Mail on Sunday, and on the leader page it tells me to vote Conservative. Then I turn the page, and there's your column telling me not to.
There is indeed, yes.
And you know, one way and another, you're allowed to write in that paper contrary to their leader.
Well, that's normal in our newspaper and in many newspapers. You don't have to. We're not like the New Labour. You don't all have to have the same opinion. And also, I'm urging people not to vote Conservative for bad reasons, not good ones, as far as most people here will be concerned. So I'm not trying to escape from my responsibilities as a reactionary here. I'm telling people not to vote Conservative because the Conservative Party has been taken over by the left, and therefore should be flushed down the lavatory like all the other parties. So don't think I'm trying to ingratiate myself with you here. I'm not.
Again, there's an opportunity for you in the audience, if you are provoked, to come back.
No, these nice
One of the articles, appropriately enough, that you've explained your Orwell obsession, was the subject of what if the Berlin Wall didn't fall?
Yeah.
And I wonder if you agree that's a very Orwellian issue. And in your own words, would you describe what the article said?
Well, I just felt that there was a moment here everybody was writing anniversary pieces about the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I missed, thanks to a manipulative colleague on another newspaper. I had the visa, I had the hotel bookings, I knew something was going to happen, I wasn't there. It's a tooth-grinding frustration to this day. But I didn't miss most of the rest of it. I was around for Ceausescu, and I'd been around for Solidarity and Gdansk, and I would later be around for the fall of Mikhail Gorbachev and the end of communism in the Soviet Union. So it was a kind of obsession of my life. And I thought that if I wanted to actually explain why it was so important and why actually it might have been a bad thing, that it would be interesting to write an essay based on the fantasy that, in fact, instead of caving in, as he needn't have done, Erich Honecker massacred the demonstrators in Leipzig that weekend and put down the revolts, and that this was supported by the hardline old guard in the Soviet Union, which could easily have happened. And to prepare myself for this, I spent quite a long time in the basement of the London Library going through the early 1989 issues of the Times. And you could not have told, you really could not have told that this was not going to happen if you had not known the future. And much of what was written at the time suggested that it would happen. And it seemed to me to be a very, well, how should I say, an instructive way, both for myself and for anyone who might happen to read it, of looking into this. I have, since it happened, often wondered whether it was a good thing for people in this country and in many other parts of the world that the Berlin Wall did fall, which I know is not a particularly nice thing to think, but I often think things which are not nice, but nonetheless, I feel that having thought them, it's my duty to pursue them and sometimes to say them.
And you describe it as an essay. It's distinct then, is it, from a job of journalism, which is to expose, discover, wheedle out. You started this as an essay, and possibly an Orwellian one. In other words, think the unthinkable, make an essay of it. Is that fair? Yeah,
also it was a distillation of experience. I did see a lot of this stuff. I spent a lot of time in East Germany before before the old regime collapsed. I knew what it had been like. Not as well as we know now, because so much of it was secret. And I had, again, had my entire life altered by the end of the Cold War. When I went to live in Moscow in June 1990, I had no idea of the earthquake which it would cause in everything that I would in future think, feel, and do. So I knew that it had changed everything that had happened to me utterly, and I think it had changed anything that anybody of my age had thought and felt utterly as well. It is the pivotal moment of our era. And if it hadn't happened, and if all that followed hadn't happened, then many, many people would not be who they are, or be doing what they're doing, or thinking what they're thinking now. So I don't think there are any rules about what is journalism and what isn't. That seemed to me to be.
And also, one of the points you made was that because the security threat ebbed, the power in Brussels went from NATO to Eurocrats, and that we know instructs a lot of your thinking about the European state.
Well, that's. Forgive me. I'd say there's a slight simplification. That what happened was several things happened. One of the old concepts of NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. The end of the Cold War meant that the Germans suddenly then became again the most important power in Europe, which is an unmentionable subject in most polite society to this day. I'm actually a Germanophile. I love Germany. I like almost everything about it. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that it has, since the end of the Cold War, become immensely powerful in all our lives. And it changed Europe. The other thing which happened was that the left no longer had to apologize for the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union was gone, this great albatross around the neck of the left was gone. And all kinds of ideas which had been imprisoned, as it were, in Central Europe and the Soviet Empire by the Berlin Wall escaped into common currency in the West, because they were no longer burdened by this constant need to say, no, no, that's not us. We don't believe in that. We didn't want that to happen. And of course, a lot of people didn't then believe the left when they said it, particularly people who'd read 1984 and could see the connections, and even more, the people who read 1984 and who lived in the Eastern European countries knew perfectly well there was a connection between the two. But the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union finished that for most people. And I now believe in some ways that it would have been better if East Germany had been taken over by the Disney company and maintained as a theme park, because people could then go and visit it and see what it was like. Whereas most people now, under 30, would not believe you if you told them what East Germany was actually like and how it functioned, and the ideas on which it was based. And
thinking that, as you do, your article had to come to a conclusion. So you've explained stridently what you think, but what was your conclusion?
Stridently?
Well, half stridently. For people who didn't read the article.
Forcefully.
What conclusion did you reach, thinking what you think and saying what you say? When you came to it, do I, Peter Hitchens, think that it would have been better if the wall had stayed up? What did you think when you...
Bit mealy-mouthed. I was tempted to say, put it back up again, and I didn't quite say it. Probably, in retrospect, I should have done.
That was one article for which you've been on long-listed, shortlisted. I'm not quite sure what the official word is. The other one I'd like to talk about, and then open it up to you, everyone, is no country on earth is more like us. They too are fighting in Afghanistan, but while we stay, Canada will soon leave. How did you put this together, an exploration of why Canada would leave fighting in Afghanistan and the UK would not? What did you do to write this article?
Well, first of all, I was increasingly revolted by the way in which we were engaged in this moronic episode in Afghanistan. I travel backwards and forwards between Oxford and London every day, and I noticed one day out of the train the rather peculiarly coloured fields just in the foothills of the Chilterns as my train headed towards Oxford. And I went out on my bicycle and I examined these fields, and I discovered that they were in fact opium poppy fields, legally grown under license by a respectable company, which I won't name here, with the permission of the British government. And I began to think, hang on a minute, we're bombing people and shooting them in Afghanistan for growing this stuff. I was also completely unconvinced for some reason by the explanations of Comrade Dr. John Reed, the former Brezhnev-era communist who was the defense secretary, who announced that we would have a mission in Afghanistan which he hoped would involve our troops leaving without a shot being fired, whereupon almost immediately the most vicious shooting war since Korea erupted around them. And
He always says he was
these people
misquoted.
don't know.
He says he was misquoted.
No, he hasn't been. Channel 4 Fact Check has done a very good job on establishing exactly what he said and the circumstances under which he said it, and he comes out pretty poorly. Check it out. I did. Anyway, the point is, I thought, why is it that in British politics, nobody, absolutely nobody, is saying that we should be pulling out of this ludicrous mission? I also live very near the John Radcliffe Hospital, towards which every few weeks corteges of dead soldiers are brought. And I see this a lot. And it makes me very cross, because I think that it's all very well having armed forces and asking people to die die in many cases simply for the traditions and discipline of the forces in which they are. But if you're going to do that, you have to have a good reason why they're exercising that discipline and following that tradition. And I didn't think that Afghanistan was in that tradition, or justified the exercise of their disciplines, or could justify the deaths of a single one of those young men who was brought back almost past my back door. So I wondered why it was that in our country, nobody, absolutely nobody in politics, and you'll notice in this election campaign it hasn't come up either, nobody was saying we should get out, whereas in Canada it had actually been decided that Canadian troops, who comparatively with ours by numbers have been taking very similar levels of casualties, are actually due to come home. So I thought, let's go and ask. And I made contact with colleagues in Canada, and I got them to set up some interviews with me, and I went out and looked. And it was perfectly obvious that if one major politician had the guts to say, it's time these people came home, they would come home. And so I wrote it. And it's true.
I found it very educational, in as much as the numbers you were saying, it's 200, it's 129 dead at the last count, the time your article was printed.
Yeah, it's gone up since then. It actually went up while I was there and continued to rise since then. They were in Kandahar, which is very, very vicious fighting indeed. And
as the bodies are driven along the roads in Canada, what happens?
Well, it started there long before it started here, that people would line the route between the airbase where they arrived, Trenton I think it is, and the hospital in Toronto where the postmortems are done. And the fire brigades would turn out with their ladders, and they'd extend them, and people would stand there with the flags draped over the edge of the motorway. And this wasn't just as it is at Wood and Bassett. This was an equivocal thing. These people were patriotic Canadians. Canada's a very patriotic country, but they were also expressing, in some way, a concern that these people were dying, and the government didn't seem to care. And there had been times when the government had tried to make it a sort of patriotic essential that you supported the war. Where imagine this, the Chief of Staff of the Army would appear during the great Canadian sports program, I suppose the equivalent of a big football program here called Hockey Night in Canada, and actually talk in a folksy way about the operation in Afghanistan. And people took some while to come round, and a lot of people, because they were fundamentally patriotic and they were very much in support of the armed forces, and Canada is very similar in a lot of ways to this country in the relation that people have with the armed forces. They even have units with similar names to ours. They have a black watch. It didn't take the form of peace marchers storming through Toronto. It took the form of respectable people of the kind whose children were in the military, lining the roads silently in what was half commemoration and half protest.
And when the political people started talking about withdrawal, did that come from the left or right? And what did they call the first politician who suggested a political solution?
It came from the left, which in a way you would have thought it should have done, and which, interestingly enough, it hasn't done here, from the New Democrats. And the politician involved was immediately called Taliban Jack, which he now wears as a badge of honor.
So now, just ask you in the audience if you'd like to pick up on anything we've heard. I began with where I left off with our previous two nominees, asking Peter Hitchens why he was, what this meant to him to be nominated. So I started in a slightly different direction. So if you'd like to ask questions about these articles or about what Peter said at the beginning, which was a great sense of pride at the Orwellian link, please do. Does anyone like to ask a question? Yes, please, over in the corner. And do please say something about yourself if you want to.
My name's Rory Gallivan, and I just wanted to ask a question about the Tory party, actually. I know your kind of mission is to see it destroyed, and I just wondered whether you're optimistic about that happening in the current circumstances.
Oh, I'm compelled to be optimistic. No, actually, I'm a profoundly pessimistic person. It's the only rational thing to be. When somebody says that stupid thing they say, oh, I'm a glass half full person, I say, you idiot, the glass is only half full when somebody is actually filling it, otherwise it's obviously in the process of being emptied. and that's why you need pessimists surrounded by the next round. No, if I succumbed entirely to reason, I'd just despair. But one can always assume that the unexpected is around the corner, and we have, I think, seen in the past couple of days quite a lot of unexpected things. What can I say?
Well, you can answer the question.
Look, no, wait a minute. I haven't not answered it yet. No, you can't say that yet.
Yet.
I'm in the process of answering it elliptically, which is the only good way of answering it. If the Tory party contains anybody in it who has any spirit at all, which is, of course, a questionable proposition, and the one on which I can't really give you any more than a guess, how they can stand being in a government with the Liberal Democrats, I do not know. And therefore, it would seem to me that this suggested that at some point in the next few months, there ought to be a very bitter revolt against what's happened to the Tory party amongst those people in the Tory party who still believe in it. The thing about what happened over the past few days that surprised me, the one combination that seems to have occurred to nobody, which would have solved all the problems of the country, would have been a Labour-Conservative coalition. What would have been wrong with that? The heir to Blair could have combined. The Tories could have got rid of George Osborne in return for Labour getting rid of Gordon Brown. Everybody would have been happy. But a grand coalition, German style, and they'd all have agreed. The problem with it is, although both parties are virtually indistinguishable in policy, as indeed are the Liberal Democrats, they have these inconvenient people called members and voters who actually believe that the parties are different. And here is the difficulty. My mission with the Tory party has been to try and persuade its members and voters that the people who lead it hate and despise them and wish they were dead, except at voting time. And this amazing demonstration by David Cameron that he is completely indistinguishable from the Liberal Democrats, who, not 2 weeks ago, he was hosing with slime for all the terrible things that they do, would seem to me to be a kind of message to Tory members and supporters that maybe they're not wanted. But it also is possible they won't get it. And if people won't get it, as we all know, they won't get it. Well, look, I wouldn't dare. That's up to them. I mean, one has hopes, but I can't. And sometimes I even speak to some of these people, but that does them no good. If I say who they are, who I speak to, I don't know. There was a scheme. I haven't heard, because I've been trapped actually on railway trains for the past 2.5 hours. I haven't heard what the latest developments are. There was a scheme at one stage to try and placate the supposed Tory right by appointing David Davis to the cabinet, which I had a feeling wouldn't come about by the middle of this afternoon, but maybe it has.
No, it hasn't so far, has it?
No, so I would think it unlikely, but whether these people will revolt again, treason doth never prosper.
Does anyone else? Yes, here, the gentleman in the middle, thank you.
Thanks. Hugo de Berg's my name. You saw out the Eastern European communists, but you've also written about China. You're going to see out the Chinese Communist Party?
No, I think Chinese are going to see us out. In fact, it is my nightmare that my grandchildren will be scurrying around the slum streets of a degraded Britain, trying to earn tips from Chinese tourists. And I don't think that that's an entirely unbelievable prospect. You go to China, I don't know whether you visited, you go to China and you see the Shanghai, there's Pudong, there's all the new stock exchange and the skyscrapers, there's the little villages where people get their houses smashed in for breaking the one-child policy, there's the squalid slums of most cities. And you look at the poor part of China and you wonder to yourself, why is it that we live so much better than they do? They work harder than we do. They're in many cases better educated than we are. How long can it last that we live in this Western luxury which we take for granted and they don't? The other thing about China, and it frightened the pants off me when I first went to Shanghai, and it still does, is this. All my life, it had been the case that you could pretty much say that prosperity and freedom marched hand in hand. The trick that the Chinese Communist Party have worked is that you can have prosperity in a police state. And I have to say, I find that very disturbing. And I think that it is probably the worst thing that comes out of modern China.
Would you like to come back at all or say something?
Well, there are so many things.
Well, you're welcome to say at least one of them. And then there is time.
I think your last point is a very good one, and I think your first point is a very good one. I think
what about in the middle? What did you think of that?
But I think you point up how poor China is, but you also haven't noticed how extraordinarily wealthy and successful China is, and how brilliantly some of the public works are. In other words, I think you've forgotten some of the very real achievements which are very good for ordinary people as well. That's my criticism, but I think your first and your last point.
Well, I haven't forgotten them. I think you have to, when you look at other people's countries, you have to say, what does this tell us? I think the attitude that for so long the foreign correspondent has is, how are these stupid people getting it wrong? Why don't they do it the way Britain does it? Seems to me to be discredited in many ways. So when I go to somebody else's country, I think, except in the case of North Korea, which is slightly different, I think, what are these people doing from which we can learn anything at all? And of course there are achievements in China, but those achievements seem to me to be less important to us than those dangers. And I have to say the threat to human liberty, which is in any case restricted to a fairly small portion of the globe, it seems to me to be almost obsessively more important than anything else.
Okay, you can keep the microphone, but I think at this point I'd like very much to say congratulations to you, Peter Hitchens, on your nomination.
Thank you.
And thank you for giving us this interview. And would you kindly come back up, Amelia and also John, and then we'll keep going. Whilst they're putting their microphones on, you've got the microphone, Hugo. Please keep going. We're going to open it up now to discussion by all of us with everyone, and we'll pass the microphone along. But continue your point.
I was just going to add to that it seems to me that you're saying something which has occurred to me and doubtless other people many times, that, well, we're marching away from liberty in many ways. The Chinese are actually marching very slowly towards it. China's becoming much more accountable, much more transparent, just at the same time as we're becoming less so. We're going in opposite directions.
I don't believe that. I see absolutely no sign that the possession of a Mercedes makes anyone more free.
Okay, hold it there. That's a disagreement, but it's a very interesting one. Give the microphone, if you would, over here to this gentleman here. So let's try and bring things together a bit. You've heard three extraordinary writers. I've done my homework to read what they've written. I recommend you, if you haven't already, that you do. So if there's things that you want to draw out that might involve them to discuss journalism, Orwell, their role, their differences, over to you for 15 minutes and we'll finish on time. Please give us your name.
My name is Patrick Towell. I'm from the UK National Commission for UNESCO, which, as you know, fights for freedom of speech. So you've all taken examples from other countries and used either your experience in other countries or stories from other countries. How do you view the UK's standing in freedom of speech, and how do you relate it to your experiences abroad?
You keep the microphone, but let's go from John down to Peter.
I think we clearly have difficulties with emerging threats and privacy laws and all the rest of it. One thing I think that Orwell would be proud of, and I think what we've been talking about tonight, all of us are good examples, is how much better journalism has become in the last couple of years. I think it's a rather unfashionable thing to say at times, particularly because there's a lot of economic pressures on newspapers that we're familiar with. But the economic crisis has sort of blown off the top of journalism, this extraordinary kind of PR-driven, celebrity-obsessed,
Speak up a bit, John.
celebrity-obsessed subject matter, which really became mainstream. And I think if you look at Amelia's paper, if you look at the Sunday Times, if you look at the Observer, if you look at the Financial Times, you look at the Economist, lots of the Times in particular, a lot of examples of newspapers that have got vastly better. So I think there are some issues with freedom, but I think we shouldn't forget that we're living, I think, in quite good times in terms of content and quality.
I think in terms of freedom of speech, we're seeing a tremendous change in the way that people are able to express themselves in this country. And I don't know whether you're an enthusiastic user of Twitter or of any of the new social media, but having been very wary of them, I'm beginning to understand how they give an extraordinary platform to people who didn't previously have a platform and are opening up new forms of freedom of speech.
I think that the principal danger to freedom of speech is what is loosely referred to as political correctness. It is extraordinary how the Newspeak chapter in 1984 predicts its effect. Where something cannot be said, it cannot be thought. And I think the speech codes, which originated largely on American campuses back in the 1980s, and which have been adopted with a huge moral force behind them, which makes people think that as a result they're tolerable, has been disastrous to the freedom of engagement and speech in this country. And there is a constant attempt to label certain opinions as pathologies or phobias, which makes them unsaleable, and indeed makes the people who voice them themselves unpersoned, which I think is very dangerous. And if you wanted, there are many other direct and more obvious threats which it's easy for people to be against. But the one which a very large number of people who maintain that they're in favor of freedom actually support either by action or inaction is that one.
Do you want to come back on that, you two, at all, Amelia and John? No? What about you?
No, it's very interesting, and I think freedom of speech in journalism is incredibly important, and certainly that's the position of UNESCO. One of the things that I'm personally interested in is people, normal people, non-media people, understanding the difference between professional journalism with editorial guidelines and other prosumer, consumer opinion, and being able to understand the differences between those things, and also when they are themselves tweeting or putting things on Facebook or blogging, understanding some of the responsibility they have when they say things about people and express opinions. So there's that kind of media literacy of us all, which is separate to being professional journalists. So I wondered if you had thoughts about that.
I think that's certainly something that we're feeling our way around day by day, particularly at The Guardian, which is really trying to promote the idea of engagement from our readers, and the question of how one headlines or how one kind of packages comments from the reader to both encourage them and allow people to engage and articulate their own opinions, but also to distance the kind of brand of the paper from some of the responses, and also how we manage the growing wealth of these voices in terms of moderating some of them and you know what exactly it is that we moderate. That
the other big problem we're all having is how to make money out of it.
Right. Now, and let me ask you that with another question from you in just a second. Newspapers. Are we going to see fewer numbers of newspapers as we go on? And is print dead, but writing alive? Do you think there's a difference that people will always be able to write like you have, maybe for electronic media, but the numbers of newspapers will decline? Would you give us an answer, and then we'll go back to some more questions from the floor?
I mean, the funny thing is, being a freelancer, you can totally market test this, because if I don't get up and have something that's any good and I can sell it, then I don't make any money. So my experience would be that, yes, if you do have a good idea and you can do it well, there is a very, very, very healthy market for it at the moment, and that is something to be very, very pleased about. There's also enormous reach for your ideas. I mean, the Goldman Sachs piece, as I was mentioning, went around the world in a heartbeat. You get extraordinary reach if you get some really good real estate, get your hands on something good. So no, there is a good market for writing. Yes, there will be fewer newspapers. There already are fewer newspapers. Yes, we may well get to a situation quite soon where we have Monday to Thursday online, and we have printed offerings on paper on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday. But no, I don't think what any of us around here do is going to go away.
In India, the situation is completely different. Newspapers are opening up by the week. You've got readership soaring. You've got bidding wars between journalists being paid unheard of amounts of money. Journalism in India is a career that you really, really want to get into. Here, perhaps not so much. I think it's the case also that probably there will be fewer newspapers around. But is it a less exciting time to be a journalist? Probably not, but it is scary.
I'm worried that I'm engaged in the 21st century equivalent of handloom weaving, that it won't last much longer. I hope this isn't true, but it seems to me that looking around, that the number of people who read for pleasure is diminishing. Although people, educated people, will read for technical purposes, they'll read for practical need, but the number of people who read, particularly read newspapers for pleasure, seems to me to be diminishing. A lot of reasons for that. One, we've trashed our education system. The other is television. But whatever it is, and the other is computer games and these things, I say to people over and over again, you'd be better off giving your children neat gin than leaving them unsupervised in front of a television screen. But and I don't actually believe in giving them neat gin. But I find that huge numbers of people still consider this to be a harmless thing. When research piles up, it features in the newspapers all the time. That does immense damage. We are in many ways ensuring that the next generation is going to be post-literate by the neglect of the rising generation. It could possibly be stopped if people would realize the danger of it, but I think reading for pleasure may well be finished. See me out, but I don't know whether there's much future in it beyond that.
Does anyone in the audience want to take us towards a conclusion? Yes, to the back. Well, hang on, let the microphone come to you, and then...
I mean, just on this political correctness point, I think that's it's easy to kind of call political correctness, but I actually think imprisoning journalists and having the sort of regime that exists in China is probably much more of a threat to freedom of speech. But also on this point about the post-literate generation, I mean, we should think about newspaper primers. I mean, my children go to one of these kind of so-called state schools that's trashed education, but they spent most of the week before the election having their own debates and that kind of thing, and sort of practicing voting and that kind of thing. And they come home with sort of a huge set of views about what's going on around them. And this is in the middle of a sort of an inner city school. So I think it's very easy to kind of say we've trashed the education system.
Yeah,
without
I guess the range of those votes, of the opinions which they have too. And I'm sure it would exclude anything remotely resembling mine. We're very good at propagandizing children.
Interestingly not. It ranged from, if the Tories get in, you'll be going to school on Saturdays, right through to kind of quite sophisticated stuff about what's going on. So, there was a range of crap, the way you get it in sort of, wider society.
Yeah.
And could you keep the microphone and answer the question, do you believe that people can differentiate between rubbish opinions and proper investigated facts? And do you think we'll have the same number of newspapers in 10 years as we have now in the UK?
I think we may not have the same number of newspapers, but I think that's because the current generation is reading and absorbing the media very differently. So they may not read it and absorb it in the way that we do. They're much more multitasking, but that doesn't make them any less sophisticated than we are or any less interested in what's going on around them. So I don't think that newspapers is the right metric. I think sort of engagement and debate is probably the right metric, and I don't think that's going down.
Anyone else in the audience? I've got another question for me to end. If you're all done in the room, you'll take another one. All right. Is there anyone who hasn't had one who'd like one? Because then we'll bring this to a conclusion. Are you in the middle, bursting to say something? No. No, it's fine. Don't have to. Okay.
Start with me.
We'll give it to you, Hugo, and then one from me, and then we'll be ending on time.
This is to Amelia Gentleman. You wrote 3 articles, or we talked about 3 of your articles, which are very moving and also very challenging. Particularly, just honing in on one, the one about the old people in the old people's homes. What would you want people to do and think as a result of your article, preferably do?
The article came out last summer, just as the government was publishing its its strategy for care of the elderly. And I think one of the things that's been very, very clear is how ill-prepared the last government, and probably all politicians, have been in their strategies for how we're going to cope with this exploding population of people who are unable to care for themselves. I think the population of people over 80 is going to double in the next 20 years, and there will be millions of people dependent on the state for their care. So I think I would hope for more thoughtful engagement with how it is that we look after them. I mean, it's the biggest problem that we're going to be facing in a couple of decades.
Are you expecting politicians to solve the problem? These politicians? Our politicians?
And I think the question of whether or not families are able to take responsibility for their own relatives is, you know, it's very, very personal, but it's clearly the case that we have changed as a society, and we probably take less responsibility for the older generation in-house, as it were, than we did previously. And, you know, whether or not that's right, I think is for debate.
Thank you. So final question from me to end on time is to ask you all for a closing comment to answer either of these two questions. One, what's your next project, without giving it away to journalists in the room who undoubtedly would steal it at once? And two, we've spoken a bit about the internet, there's twittering and tweeting going on. What do you think Orwell would have made of the internet? So, and the way that we use it and the way we can be traced through it. So either about yourself or about Orwell. Let's start with you, John, and work back down towards Peter, which means going to Amelia second. Sorry.
Orwell's a tough one on the thing. I think the thing about the internet, which we all have to do, and I'm sure Orwell would have supported, is to try and say, look, this is the most powerful means of communication that there will ever be. When it's used correctly, it's phenomenal. An example from Goldman. Goldman got, within, I think, a week, it got 1.2 million hits. Now, to get an article about a really boring bank of 10,000 words to get over 1 million hits is, you know, it shows that you can really, really reach people. And Amelia's point is right too, that you can actually engage people sensibly, and they're not all sort of nutters all arguing with themselves. So I think it probably, I'm sure Peter will disagree with me, probably would be welcomed, but needs to be, we need to be a lot smarter and a lot cleverer in how we do it. And if I can draw a contrast, if you look at successful companies on like internet, on the internet, like Google and Facebook, their offering is incredibly rich. When you go onto these websites, you know, they're very engaging, they're very well done. You go onto the average newspaper website and it's rubbish. It's very two-dimensional. You're not given any particular reason. There's nothing to bind you or to fix you there. Now the iPad and all these other things may help with that. But we are desperately slow and behind the curve in our industry to come up with ways that we can actually engage people. And that's one reason why we're not making any money.
I'm happy to reveal what I'm working on next because it's kind of, again, a subject that is eye-rollingly tedious and resurface, and I don't think anybody's likely to steal it as a theme. But it's the question of how people who are on incapacity benefit are having their kind of health reassessed by a private company. Now, I think if Orwell were around, he would use the internet to help him research. I mean, I think anybody who doesn't use the internet to kind of, as a positive tool is crazy. But specifically on this story, I've written one kind of short story on it, and I've had dozens and dozens and dozens of responses from people who've got very, very interesting stories and very disturbing stories about how a new private company that's been contracted by the government to reassess their invalidity status or whether or not they have to go back to work have been wrongly reassessed, and people with terminal cancer have been told that they must stop claiming benefit and start working. So it's a very, very useful tool day to day. And there's also a new site that I'm experimenting with using called something like Help Me Investigate, something which I'm hoping will be fantastically useful.
Oh, I just think Orwell would be profoundly dispirited by the coarseness and crudity of so much